Mr Speaker, the Labor Party supported this bill on its introduction, and of course the Labor Party will always support legislation that is designed to protect and enhance the rights of victims. For too long in our system, the victims have been the forgotten people. The way our British system of justice is set up is that we have the Crown against Smith. Smith is the offender, Crown is the state prosecutes the offender, but people forgot about the victim. So under Labor governments in the past, we've had the Victims of Offences Act, the Victims' Rights Act. Labor has consistently supported bringing forward the rights of victims, putting them at the centre of the system, providing them with the protection that they need. So we supported this bill, but as I said on the introduction of the bill, it was a deeply flawed piece of legislation. Mr Chairman, you're from Invercargill. Mr Speaker, you're from Invercargill. The case that led to the introduction of the bill was in your electorate, and you'll be very familiar with it. It was a case of a young woman who had been the victim of sexual violation. The offender was charged, he was convicted, he was imprisoned, and the woman felt probably that justice might have been done. But one day she came home to her home from work to find that the person who had sexually violated her had moved into the house next door. She had absolutely no power to do anything about that fact. It's hard for any of us that might not have fortunately ever had the experience to imagine what it would be like to be the victim of a sexual violator and to find that that person was now living on your doorstep, and every day you would be reminded of their presence and the act that they had committed against you. So the Minister said she had solved this problem and she brought in a piece of legislation. Well, the tragedy of that piece of legislation, Mr Speaker, is that it would do absolutely nothing to the woman whose case apparently led to the legislation being introduced. Because for reasons that none of us on this side of the House understood, the Minister of Justice said this will only apply if the offender has been sentenced to at least 5 years in imprisonment. In this case, the offender had been sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. And I, for the life of me, could not understand why you would not provide protection across the board for any victim of a serious violent or sexual offence. And I said on the introduction of this bill, this will not do. I said that there is in the Parole Act a definition that separates serious offending from less serious offending, and that was 2 years. Well, the Select Committee looked at this and heard the submissions, and they said, yes, we'll change it. They said, we'll change it to 3. Why 3? Just another figure plucked out of the air. And I pushed, I approached the Minister personally, and finally we've got a threshold that makes sense. Finally, we have a threshold that makes sense, and I welcome that. We got other changes that made this legislation rather more useful. As the bill was introduced by the Minister, you had to wait till the offender was released from prison before you could get a non-contact order. And for many people, they would only find out that they needed that after the person had been released from prison, and by then it was too late. They were in contact with the person. They had that sense of fear and dread that a victim will often feel when they're confronted with the person who offended against them. So we got another change made to the bill that said at any time after sentencing, the non-contact order can be applied for. And we heard from submissions before the Select Committee that often the offender will not be responsible for creating fear on the part of the victim, but the offender will delegate that to an associate who will turn up at the workplace, turn up at the educational institution, turn up at the residence of the victim, and the bill would have been able to do nothing about that. Well, we changed the bill again so that where there had been an instruction from the offender to an associate to act in that way, where the person had acted and where there was a fear on the part of the victim, we could deal with the associate. So, in the end, we made this weak and insipid piece of legislation a little bit more effective. But I want to say this to the government members of the House. In my hand here, I've got the regulatory impact statement. You know, this piece of legislation introduced with such flourish, you know how many orders that they anticipated they'd make a year? 10, Mr. Speaker, 10. You know how many inmates are released each year who have been convicted and imprisoned for serious sexual and violent offending? It's 1,000. 1,000 a year, and we were dealing with 0.1% of them. 0.1%. Maybe with the changes in the bill, we'll deal with a few more. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, this sort of legislation is only sticking plaster legislation. It doesn't go to the cause of what we need to do to prevent victims. Having the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff does not stop the pain. It does not stop the hurt. I mentioned in the last stage of this bill that earlier this week I had been to see the family of Arun Kumar, the Henderson dairy owner who was murdered in his dairy by a 13-year-old child. And what struck me from that experience, Mr. Speaker, was that nothing I could say, nothing that Rajem Prasad or Phil Twyford could say could in any way really ease the pain and the tragedy that that family was suffering. The thing that we have to do when you see an elderly man who has lost a son, when you see a woman whose husband died in her arms, as Arun Kumar did, when you see the children there who will never have a grandparent for a grandfather for their own children, you know that you've got to do something more than an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. You can't bring back a life. And all of the facts that we've seen that have come out of this, young kids in the streets of Henderson, not at school when they should be, a truancy service that's not apparently working, kids that were demanding money, that had been around this shopping centre for months, years, and nothing was done. No community police station, not enough police seen on the street. And I noticed that it was the Minister of Police that led the third reading of this bill. Well, that minister appeared before the Select Committee last week and had excuses, only excuses, for the fact that 6 budgets have been brought down by this government, and in every budget, the policing money that is expended on protecting our community has been cut in real terms. Cut in real terms. Every year, $114 million cut out of the police budget. No wonder Inspector Greg O'Connor says policing will get harder this year. So the sticking plaster legislation is okay, but what about the fence at the top of the cliff? What about decent policing? What about the fact that 16 community police stations have been closed by this national government? And what did the people of Henderson say they most wanted? A community police station in the shopping centre, so there was a presence there. Labor introduced 1,000 extra police officers in its last term in Parliament, and in the last couple of years, in conjunction with New Zealand First, in the last couple of years our police staffing has been cut. I don't want to keep going to funerals of people who have been murdered when that was a preventable situation. I want to say finally, Mr. Speaker, on the other side of this legislation about sexual offending. I was talking to Kim McGregor, who runs and has done for many years a group that protects or works with the victims of sexual offending. You know what she told me, Mr. Speaker? She said, for every 100 women in this country who are sexually violated, just one, will see their offender convicted and imprisoned for that offence. And she said, I deal with women every day of the week that will not go through our adversarial court system because they don't believe that they will see justice done. They believe that they will be re-victimised. And I say to the Minister, I plead with the Minister, no more sticking plaster legislation. Let's do something real. Let's change the system. Let's have an inquisitorial system where the victim is not the person on trial. Let's have a system that prevents people falling through the cracks. Let's do something more than simply address 0.1% of the victims of those offences, which is what the sum achievement of this bill actually is.
Kevin Haig. Mr Speaker, I rise to take probably a shortened call on behalf of